Okay, welcome back. We've been for the last couple of months or so, actually about 3 months now. We've been talking about the old American West, and we've spent a lot of time talking about getting up to this point, which is where we're going to discuss today some of the real, or next few weeks, some of the iconic characters of the Old West. People that everybody has heard about. The James Gang, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday. We're gonna look into these guys, and we're gonna see the real picture of what these people were really like. Uh, Sometimes pretty authentic what you see in the movies and on TV. Sometimes not so much. So anyway, let's start out with today. We're going to talk about the Jesse James Gang. Um, I suspect there's not another name associated with the old American West more so than Jesse James. His name is just an iconic name. He's a figure that just stands out, not because he was necessarily a good person, but because what he accomplished and what he did and for how long he was uh, on the scene. A lot of times these old outlaws and figures like Jesse James, or not just James, but old figures of the old West, they were kind of like comets. They just kind of flashed across the sky. They burned brightly for a very short period of time, and then you know they were gone. Not so much so with the Jesse James gang. He was on the scene for a good 20 years, and he was nationally known. Even in his lifetime, he was indeed a legend in his own time. Uh, and as a result, that's one reason that we know so much about him and why so many people have heard of him. I always start out, of course, with a painting, and this is another painting by my very favorite local artist, man by the name of Andy Thomas. And this is the James Gang as they're riding out of the failed um, bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, which really kind of spelled the end of the James Gang. But this is a painting he did of them riding out, being chased at Northfield, Minnesota. So, what can we say about the James Younger Gang? And I saw it the James Younger Gang because later on they were joined by their good friends, the Younger brothers. And so it becomes known as the James Younger Gang. Like I said, they stand out as the greatest of them all. There's nobody even close, really, in Old West history. Well, how did they get their start? Well, they got their start in the Civil War. Um, Frank James and Cole Younger were born and raised in Clay County, Missouri, to the east of Kansas City. Um, and they joined up on the side of the Confederacy very early on in their life. You know, Missouri was one of those states that was kind of exactly what it. Caleb, could you hear me? Okay. Anyway, they didn't know exactly what they wanted to do. Part of Missouri was very pro-union. Another part was extremely Southern and Confederate. The part along the Missouri River in the that runs along the central part of Missouri was called Little Dixie, and that's where Jesse James and the Youngers and some of these other people were raised. And as a result, their sentiments lay very heavily with the South. And so they joined up on the Civil War. Frank James and Cole Younger did. And they fought at one of the very first battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Wilson's Creek, which was fought just a couple of miles from where I sat. And they become kind of disillusioned at the end of the battle because they sensed that the commanders of the army weren't really out to win the fight. They felt like that they could have won a lot better had they fought a lot differently. As a result, they kind of broke off and formed their own little what was called partisan gang or guerrilla gang. The leaders of these was a man by the name of William Quantrell, who had as one of his associates a man by the name of Bloody Bill Anderson. And later on, Anderson was kind of kicked out of Quantrell's gang because he was so violent, if you can believe that. Um, anyway, these are the people with which Frank and Cole Younger and later Jesse rode with throughout the Civil War, and they were very violent. They were noted for their ferocity, and they really took no quarter. They were really a very, it was really almost like an outlaw gang even at that time. They called themselves partisans. They didn't call themselves guerrilla fighters. But since they weren't associated with the regular army, since they fought on their own, they were not subject to the rules of the amnesty, which was granted by the Union authorities at the end of the war. So the result was that, unlike most ex Confederate soldiers, once they returned home and the war was over, it was very difficult for them to blend back into their way of life. They were not accepted by the Union authorities, and the result was that they had a very difficult time making a living. So they decided to turn to what they did best. And what they did best, loot and rob and steal. And so that was the beginning of the Jesse James gang.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
This is a photograph of William Clark Quantrell, the leader of the partisan gang that they rode with. And Quantrell was an ex school teacher, kind of like myself. And he got out here and he was a very violent man. This is Bloody Bill Anderson. As I told you, he was the one that Jesse and Frank rode with toward the latter part of the Civil War. And he had split off from Quantrell, mainly because Quantrell thought he was too violent, if you can believe that. So that'll give you some idea of how violent he was. So these were the mentors of Jesse James and Frank James and Cole Younger and his brothers. So what were these guys like? Well, Frank was the oldest. Frank was older by 4 years than Jesse. But as the gang developed and as they did their, uh, activities across for the next 20 years as the Jesse James gang, Jesse actually became the acknowledged leader. Even though Jesse was younger, Frank was very content to let him kind of be the leader of the gang. Uh, Jesse was about 5'11, as was Frank. Uh, he was also extremely muscular, blue eyes, light brown hair, had a very fiery temper, and he absolutely hated the North. Now, everything I just said about Jesse, you could say for the most part about Frank. He also was the same way, except uh, Frank was a little bit more bookish. He was a little bit more introverted, and he kind of liked to be by himself. And he wasn't as gregarious as Jesse was. Jesse was a very outgoing person, always making fun, joking, laughing. He was also an extremely religious person. I know that may sound wild. We're talking about one of the most dangerous outlaws of American history. But his father was a minister, and he had raised Jesse and Frank up in the church, and they were deeply religious men. And Jesse was known to read the Bible every day. And after he got married and had his own two children with him, he would read them Bible verses at night. So, yes, he was a violent outlaw. Yes, he was a murderer. Yes, he was a bank robber, a train robber. He did all these things, but he was also a very deeply religious man. And he just had such a deep hatred against the Union that he felt like what he was doing was almost, biblical. And he was almost called to do what he was doing. Now, Frank, like I said, was about the same, only he was a much more an introverted type person. And he didn't quite have the aggressiveness of his brother. Jesse was an extremely aggressive and violent person. Frank was very dangerous, but he was quiet. A lot of people feared Frank more than they feared Jesse because they said you could see Jesse coming a mile away. Frank, you never knew where he was coming from. He was very quiet. He didn't reveal himself very well. And so a lot of people actually were more scared of Frank in the gang than they were Jesse, at least in the beginning. This is a picture of Jesse James as a very young man. This would have been when he would have been about 15, 16 years old when he had first joined the Partisan Rangers with Quantrell and then later Bloody Bill Anderson. Just a child. Um, I think we sometimes forget, folks, how young some of these Civil War soldiers were. But you can see he wasn't an adult by any means at all. He was just a young kid. This is Frank. This was taken quite a bit later. This was not when he was real young, but he was fairly young at that time. So you can see he was a little bit more stern than Jesse. Jesse just gave off a different appearance. Now, as I've told you, after they got back from the Civil War, they were unable to assimilate back into society, and so they decided to start robbing and pillaging and looting. So they decided on February 13th, 1866, to do something that nobody else had ever done in the history of America. They decided to rob a bank in broad daylight. Now, people had robbed banks before in the United States, but they always just broke into them at night and opened up the vault and got stuff. Nobody had actually robbed a bank in broad daylight. Well, they decided they were going to do it, and they chose Liberty, Missouri, of all places. Liberty, Missouri was almost their hometown. Everybody knew them. When they rode into town, it wasn't like when they rode into town, nobody recognized them, even though they put masks on after they started robbing. Everybody knew who Frank and Jesse James were. They were local. They lived just down the road. So they were pretty unusual in that regard. They walked out of the bank with $60,000. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but $60,000 is still a lot of money to me in this day and age. Imagine what it was in 1866. It would have been a fortune. And yes, they had to split it with some other gang members, but for the most part, these guys were just overloaded with money. There wasn't much they couldn't do with $60,000 in cash. So it was a very successful bank robbery. In the process, as they were whooping and hollering and going back down the street on their horses and firing off their guns, just basically to scare pedestrians off the street, apparently one of the members, we don't know for sure which one, shot a William Jewell College student who was on the street by the name of George Wymore and killed him. That kind of didn't sit too well with the people of Liberty. One thing to rob a bank, another thing to kill another person. And they weren't too happy about that. But, nevertheless, they did. Jesse was 19, Frank was 23. Think about this. Jesse was still a teenager, and Frank wasn't much more at this time. They began a life of crime that went on in for another at least 15 years. They would rob 12 banks, 7 trains, 5 stagecoaches in 11 different states. So it's just a remarkable career in that regard. We don't know for sure how many people they killed. The figure I've read most likely was about 12. May have been more than that, may not have been that many. But they did kill several people. Okay, most of them in cold blood. This is the Liberty, Missouri Bank, Clay County, Missouri, first daylight bank holdup in the United States, and attributed to the Jesse James gang. They say it's attributed to it because some people think that maybe he wasn't there, but he was. Trust me. And like I said, everybody knew these people. Okay, well, that was so successful. They said, "Gee whiz, let's do this again." That was fun. We got a lot of money. And so over the next couple of months, they robbed a couple more banks, Lexington and Richmond, Missouri, which again, not very far from their hometown of Liberty, or actually a little town called Kearney at that time. Lexington and Richmond are both on the Missouri River. Lexington on the south side, Richmond about 6 miles away on the north side. And again, kind of in their neighborhood. And, even though it wasn't nearly as much as what they got out of the Clay County Bank, it was still a pretty good haul. And then for about 3 years, they kind of disappeared. They just kind of quieted down. Um, in fact, the case, we don't know for sure of another bank robbery associated with the one of his relatives would probably convinced him to rob the Russellville, Kentucky bank. So we're pretty sure they did that. They probably did some other things that we aren't aware of. Uh, they roamed all over. That's one thing that someone commented to me. They said they didn't realize how far across the United States they roamed. Uh, Folks, they were in California, they were in Virginia, they were in Maryland. They did bank robberies and robberies very far away, comparatively so. It was also at Russellville that their old friend Cole Younger, their fellow guerrilla, joined the gang and brought with him his two brothers, Jim and Bob. And so that kind of made up the nucleus of the gang right then. Jesse and Frank and Cole and Jim and Bob Younger, Woodhite, and a couple other guys. But there was about 8 of them that were in this gang at this period of time. Cole and Jesse did not always get along. There was some little bit of rivalry between the two. Cole was a little bit older and he thought he ought to be the head of the gang, but everybody knew Jesse was the man. After the Russellville, Kentucky bank robbery, Jesse and they all lay kind of low again because that's what they do when they rob a bank and then they just kind of disappear. But Jesse, during this last time after Russellville, Kentucky, actually spent a lot of time back home, mainly because he was squiring his younger cousin, Zerelda, who was named after his mother. His mother's name was Zerelda, and he buried his first cousin, and her name was Zerelda. They called her Z, Zee. And so during this time, he was back and forth a lot between his mother's farm at Kearney, Missouri. Neighbors said he came to church almost every Sunday, was always asking for him to pray for his brother, but not himself. A lot of psychologists would say Jesse probably thought he was beyond redemption. And, of course, if you're a Christian like I am, you know that nobody is beyond redemption, but still yet, he did some pretty serious crimes. So this is Cole Younger. This is Cole who rode with the gang. This would have been about the period of time that he was riding with the gang. December 1869, Jesse and Frank and their gang decide that they're going to rob another bank. And this time they chose the little town of Gallatin, Missouri, up in the northwest part of Missouri. I had some very good friends who lived at Gallatin for many years, and we visited with them, and they took me down to the Gallatin Bank, which is now a museum. And, this was the next bank they robbed. This was also kind of the bank that gave them national recognition. Up to this time, the James Gang had been kind of people knew who it was and they knew him, but they really were pretty local celebrities, as you might say. After the Gallatin, Missouri bank robbery, they became nationally known figures throughout the United States. And here's the reason why. They walked into the bank and they didn't choose this bank by accident, according to what I've read. They thought that the man who was president of the bank and teller of the bank was the man who had killed their old friend Bloody Bill Anderson during the Civil War. Bloody Bill had been tracked down right at the end of the Civil War and was killed, and actually chopped his head off and paraded it around different towns to show everybody because he was such a bad person. Well, they thought that they knew the man that was the main teller at the bank was this man. They walked in, and John Sheets was the teller at the bank that day. This was not the man that killed Bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse, though, thought it was. And Jesse shot him in cold blood. I mean, there was no reason to kill him. The guy complied totally with him. but Jesse uttered some statements. There were some other people in the bank that were as it being held up, and he basically just shot him in cold blood because he was avenging his old pal, Bloody Bill Anderson, or at least he thought he was. Uh, some of the citizens heard the bank being robbed. They ran and got their guns, and as they were leaving the bank, there was a gunfight. Jesse's horse got shot. Jesse fell to the ground. Frank come running back and did one of these circus stunts that you've probably seen in movies where he grabbed his arm and swung Jesse up back behind him, and they took off riding through the hills of northern Missouri uh, till they could get back home. So this was the bank robbery that kind of made him nationally known. And here's the reason. Jesse had discovered that there was a newspaper editor in Kansas City, Missouri, a man by the name of John Newman Edwards. And John Newman Edwards was a very viral Southern sympathizer. Even though the Civil War was over, he was always writing articles and just saying some really vile things about the North. So Jesse decides he's going to write a letter to John Newman Edwards where he basically explained his position. And Jesse began what could only be called the most effective public relations campaign of the Wild West. He started writing letters to John Newman Edwards, explaining his position, sometimes denying crimes, sometimes telling him why he did it. And Edwards became his mouthpiece throughout the United States. And this is how the James game became nationally known, because they actually started almost being marketing themselves through the newspaper. And the result was that he became almost a folk hero in parts of the United States, particularly the central part of Missouri. He was almost like a Robin Hood type character. That's how Newman Edwards was portraying him, as robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. He was basically only targeting the bankers and the railroad men, which everybody hated. Um, and he said, he's just doing what we'd all like to do. And he will never take money from the poor people. He only takes them from the rich, which was absolutely not true. But that's beside the point. That's how they portrayed him. So this is the inside of the Gallatin, Missouri Bank. You can see the lobby here and the display case of some of the guns and some of the paraphernalia that was left behind and what all. And this is kind of a memorial to the Gallatin, Missouri bank robbery. I've been in this bank and it's quite an interesting thing. Well, now they decided, hey, let's do something a little different. The Pinkertons had been hired by the Bankers Association to find the James boys. And so they decided, well, let's do something different. They decided to rob a railroad. Nobody had ever robbed a railroad before. I mean, think about this. They were the first people in America to pull a daylight bank robbery. They were the first people to rob a railroad. So that's one reason that they became so well known. So for about 3 years, basically they kind of laid low again, and the Pinkertons couldn't find them. But then in 1873, they decided to rob the railroad coming out of Council Bluffs, Iowa. Supposedly there was a big haul of money being transported. That wasn't the case. They didn't get near as much money as they thought they were going to. But they robbed the Rock Island Railroad, and then they robbed a few more. And after this robbery, the governor of Missouri had enough. He said, okay, enough is enough. We got to put this gang down. They're killing people. They're robbing banks. They're robbing railroads. They're just like mad dogs. So he put out a big reward. He hired a special secret agent type force to try to hunt the gang down. Some of them were Pinkertons. Well, the Youngers and the Jameses weren't stupid, so they decided again they needed to lay low for a little bit. The Youngers headed off to Texas. Jesse and Frank headed to Nashville, and they lived very quietly for the next 3 years in Nashville, Tennessee. Just blended in as they liked to race horses. They bought race horses. They were commodities brokers. They said they supposedly bought and sold horses, um, whatever. It looked like maybe the James Younger gang was going to stop. And then the Pinkertons did something really stupid. This is the Rock Island Railroad. This is the railroad they robbed. The Pinkertons did a really stupid thing. They had gotten word in 1875 that Jesse and Frank were back at their mother's farm. Some local farmer, oh, ice into the hay. It may have been a flashbang type thing, whatever. But whatever happened was it rolled into the fireplace. And Zerelda, the mother, Zerelda Salmons, and and her little son Archie, who was only 9 years old and from all accounts was a little bit mentally handicapped. And by the way, Jesse and Frank loved their little brother Archie. Well, anyway, Zerelda tried to reach in and grab the thing, and when she did, it blew up. It blew her hand and part of her lower arm off. The shrapnel killed Archie. So the Pinkertons ended up really doing something silly because now the James boys were really angry. Before they had just been robbing, but now they were extremely angry. And on top of that, it also angered most of the members of the area, the community. And really, for all practical purposes, after this, Jesse and Frank were almost like a protected species in the Clay County area. They could come and go as they wanted, and nobody was going to say a word about them because they were so upset with what they'd done to Israel and Archie. Uh, the one thing it did do was push the gang out of their normal territory of robbery. And one of their new members of their group talked them into robbing the bank at Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. Here's the Jesse James farm. You can still visit it today. Uh, this is a grave of Jesse James, but this is not where he is buried. He is buried in a local cemetery. They had to move his grave. Uh, for many years, Zerelda would charge admission to her farm after Jesse died. And when she would sell rocks to people for a quarter apiece, she would pick a rock up off his grave and sell it to them for a quarter apiece. This is how she made a living. That night, after everybody had left, she'd go down to the creek, get a bucket full of new rocks and put them on the grave. And the next morning, the people would show up, and here she'd be picking a rock off the grave. And they thought they had something really unique here, and all they were doing was picking up creek gravel. But you know, this was how she had to make a living. You'll notice if you look real closely, you'll notice here her right arm is missing her hand, uh, where it got blown off. So Jesse and Frank and Cole and Jim and Bob Younger, plus three new guys, Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell, decided to go to Northfield, Minnesota to rob a bank. Now, why in the world would they go to Northfield, Minnesota? Well, for one reason, Bill Chadwell was from there and he knew the bank. And he talked the gang into saying, boy, they just got a whole bunch of money. And, on top of that, the man that owned the bank was a former Union general by the name of Adelbert Ames. And they really had a grudge to get this guy. I'm not for sure why. I can't recall what the grudge was, but I know that there was some bad feelings against Ames. It had to do with Bloody Bill Anderson. But for whatever reason, they decided they were going to go to Northfield, Minnesota. Now, this was an area of pacifist, uh, basically people that had moved in from Northern Europe, a lot of Scandinavians, and they were not violent people at all. And Chadwell said, this is going to be a walk in the park, folks. We're going to walk into this bank and they're going to hand their money over to us, and it's going to be so easy. Anything but, anything but easy. So they get into town September 7th, the 8 members ride in, and they're very obviously something's going on. They're, first of all, They're not from there. And people, 8 guys right in the bank. They were all dressed alike. They had on what was called slickers, like raincoats. They had hats kind of pulled down over their eyes. And people immediately became suspicious, like, hey, who are these guys and what are they doing? 5 of the members got off their horses and stood outside on the street while Jesse and Bob and Charlie uh, Pitts went into the bank. They tried to rob the bank, but they didn't get it accomplished because the bank had installed a new time lock. And they were furious with the banker, ended up killing the banker. Uh, but in between time, members of the town had heard gunshots inside the bank and they had armed themselves. And when Jesse and Bob and Charlie came out on the street, there were people begin taking pot shots at them from windows, from rooms. Uh, and it was just a disaster, folks. Uh, it was an absolute disaster. This is a scene from downtown Northfield, Minnesota, taken in the summer of 1876. By the way, I want you to think about this. Summer of 1876, the centennial of the country. It's 100 years since the Declaration of Independence has been signed, and it was a big goings on in the country. The summer of '76 is also a pretty apocalyptic year for the Old West history. Uh, Jesse James and his gang get practically annihilated at Northfield. Uh, Custer does get annihilated at the Little Bighorn, and Wild Bill Hickok gets killed in Deadwood, South Dakota, probably the best known gunslinger in the Old West. So kind of a big summer. But anyway, this is downtown Northfield, Minnesota. So they begin fighting back. They killed Miller and Chadwell and Pitts. They severely injured all 3 of the Youngers. Um, the only people that got out without being injured seriously was Jesse and Frank. After about 2 days of being on the run with the posse after them, Jesse and Frank decided to leave the Youngers because they were in such bad shape they couldn't ride anymore. And depending on who you listen to, the Youngers told them go ahead and leave, and some people say no. Jesse and Frank just left them, to fend for themselves. But whatever, the Youngers were all captured. They were all tried, sent to prison. Bob ended up dying in prison of tuberculosis. Cole and Jim eventually were paroled after about 25 years. They spent a long time in the Minnesota State Prison. Jim committed suicide in 1901. Cole moved back to Lee Summit, Missouri, and he and Frank kind of joined up back together and went on the vaudeville circuit and told their story on the stage for quite a while, at least for a little while. And then Frank got where he couldn't stand that because remember, Frank wasn't this type of person. Cole Younger was. Cole loved being out in the public. Cole Younger dies in 1916. And this is the Northfield, Minnesota Bank. As it looked, this would have been the entrance to the bank over here. This was another type of shops here. It's like merchandise shops, but this is the bank entrance here. This is a group photo of the ones that were captured. You got Plel Miller, who was killed. Bill Chadwell was killed. Jim Younger survived. Charlie Pitts was killed. Cole Younger and Bob Younger. So 6 of the 8 members of the gang were killed or captured at Northfield. So that meant that Jesse and Frank had to find a whole new gang. So they started recruiting gang members, and folks, they recruited a bunch of, they were not original gangsters, as the street people would say today. Let's put it that way. They were young. They were not veterans of the Civil War. They weren't loyal. They just were not the outlaws that Jesse and Frank were. Frank sensed this very fast, and he ended up leaving. He said, Jesse, I've had enough of it. I'm going to try to go out here and live my life quietly. And he actually moved to Baltimore, Maryland with his wife and children and tried to live a very quiet life. Jesse and this new gang of wild, young rebels uh, take off, and folks, it just is not the same. They rob places, but they're just not. It's just not working out at all. Finally, Jesse moves to St. Joe, Missouri, and it kind of seems like he's kind of settling down a little bit. Maybe he's going to quit too, but he's still got a price on his head. Everybody's still looking for Jesse and Frank James, and two of the new members of the gang, two brothers by the name of Charlie and Bob Ford, decide that they're going to cash in. They get a hold of the governor and they say, "Hey, governor, we can deliver Jesse James for you." And there was a $10,000 reward on Jesse James's head. And the governor says, "Fine, you bring me Jesse James, you'll get $10,000." Well, they end up killing him, and they didn't get very much of the money. They got a little bit of it, but the sheriff of and the marshal of St. Joe and the sheriff of the county actually got the most of it, and Bob and Charlie got very little. April 2nd, 1882, Bob Ford was inside Jesse's house in St. Joe, and it's almost like Jesse sensed that it was almost like he was tempting him. Jesse never took his guns off. He always wore his guns. He always had a gun with him when he was in bed. He never was away from his guns. He apparently looked at Bob and he said, "Bob, doesn't that picture look kind of crooked on the wall?" Turns his back to Bob, takes his guns off, lays them on a table, and gets up on a chair with his back to Bob, almost tempting him. Some people think that Jesse was so strong natured that he thought nobody would try to kill him. Bob Ford pulled out his gun, shot him in the back of the head, and killed him. Gave himself up, went to trial, was acquitted of murder, obviously. Uh, you know, and Frank James gave himself up. He gave himself up to the governor, and he said, "Hey, I want to go straight." And the governor said, "Well, you're going to have to be tried for the murder in Gallatin, Missouri, because that's the only one they could actually pin on Jesse and Frank." And so he said, "Fine." He was tried in Gallatin, Missouri, found innocent, not surprisingly, and came back and lived his life out on his old farm where his mother was. Went with Cole Younger on the vaudeville circuit. Died quietly in his bed in 1915, 70 years of age. This is Jesse, right near the end of his life. This would have been a picture taken of him right in his early 30s, and he was only 34 when he died. This is the house that he was killed in. You can go to St. Joe and you can still see this house, and it can be toured. It's not in the same location. They've moved it. This is Bob Ford. Poor old Bob. He didn't come to any good ending himself. Bob tried to go out on the vaudeville circuit and tell his story, but people hated Bob Ford. The dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard. Mr. Howard was the alias that Jesse James was using, and he ended up not having a very good life. He only lived there for a few years. Charlie, by the way, his brother that was involved in the killing, also he committed suicide. Bob ended up trying to run a saloon in Greed, Colorado, and somebody walked in with a shotgun and yelled, "Hey, Bob," and shot him. Killed him on the spot. So Bob Ford never enjoyed any of the riches or the celebrity that I think he thought he was going to get from killing Jesse James. This is Frank and Cole in their older years. This is Cole after he got out of prison, and this is Frank probably in the early 1900s. This is what they look like. Now, there were other gangs besides the Jesse James gang. None of them even came close to being Jesse James, except maybe the Dalton gang. And I'm going to tell you just their story just real briefly here. The Daltons were from Oklahoma, and they were cousins with the younger brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett Dalton. They were cousins with the Youngers. The Youngers and the Jameses were not cousins. I know a lot of people think this, but they were not. But the Daltons and the Youngers were cousins. 1891, the Dalton gang began to rob railroads and banks. quite a bit after the James gang, but they were kind of picking up the mantle. They were kind of going to be the next big thing, they thought. And they were pretty big. They robbed mainly out of the Oklahoma Indian Nation, and they were fairly successful. This is a photograph of Grat and Bob and Emmett, the three Daltons. Well, they decided they were going to do something even the James gang never tried. They decided they were going to rob two banks at the same time. And so they decided to rob two banks in Coffeyville, Kansas, right across the line from Joplin, Missouri. And they ended up going in, and just like Northfield, it was a disaster. They were shot at, and they were all shot up. They were trapped in an alley, and all of them were killed except for Emmett. It became known as Death Alley. You can go to Coffeyville, and they've got the banks, kind of like museums, and Death Alley. You can tour Death Alley, and this is the Dalton gang. Wasn't just the three Daltons, but it was a couple other guys with them. This is the four guys that were killed in Death Alley. So that's it for the James brothers. I always end with a book and a movie. There's a fairly new movie out that came out about 10 years ago called The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. Now, it's not your typical Westerns. It's kind of a psychological Western. It really dwells deep inside the mind of Jesse and particularly Bob Ford. It's almost more of a movie about Bob than it is Jesse. Stars Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. And Casey Affleck actually won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. A lot of people thought Brad Pitt should have won for his portrayal of Jesse James. Very well acclaimed movie, a little violent, has some bad language in it, but it's a pretty good movie if you're interested in the life of Jesse James, particularly the end of his life. There are hundreds of books about Jesse James. I would highly recommend that you read The Last Rebel of the Civil War, Jesse James by T.J. Stiles. It is an absolutely excellent book. And it probably does as good a job of telling about the life of Jesse James as anybody has ever done. So that's it for the day. I appreciate you being with me. Next week, we're going to talk about the most mysterious character of the Old West, Billy the Kid. More has been written about Billy the Kid and less is known than any other character in the American West. So I hope you'll be able to join with me, and we'll see you next week.